The year is 1946. The Second World War has just ended. The Nuremberg trials are underway, the world watching as the architects of Nazi atrocity are brought to account. Among the crimes being prosecuted are the medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors on concentration camp prisoners, experiments on unwilling human subjects carried out in the name of science, producing suffering on a scale that the civilized world has declared will never be permitted again. In that same year, a team of American researchers funded by the United States Public Health Service arrives in Guatemala. They have chosen Guatemala carefully. They need a population with limited legal protections. They need access to prisoners, to psychiatric patients, to soldiers. They need a government willing to look the other way. They need, in short, people who cannot say no. Over the next 2 years, they will deliberately infect more than 1,300 Guatemalan men and women with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. They will do this without the knowledge or consent of a single one of them. They will apply bacteria directly to genitals, forearms, and faces. They will pay infected sex workers to sleep with prisoners. They will inoculate psychiatric patients who have no capacity to understand what is being done to them. At least 83 of those people will die. The experiment will be kept secret for 63 years. Welcome back to the darkest experiments. We are deep inside the final chapter now, the darkest depths. Last time, we were with Harry Harlow and his pit of despair, a chamber designed to produce depression in infant monkeys, producing instead a permanent record of what the complete absence of love does to a developing creature. Today, we leave the animal laboratory entirely. The subjects of this experiment are human beings. The perpetrators are employees of the United States government. The setting is a country whose people were chosen precisely because the power differential between themselves and their experimenters was so extreme that resistance was impossible. The Guatemala syphilis experiment is not a story about rogue scientists. It is a story about institutional decision-making, about the choices made at every level of a government research bureaucracy, and about how those choices were hidden, rationalized, and eventually, finally, dragged into the light. The late 1940s were a period of significant anxiety about sexually transmitted diseases in the United States military. The Second World War had seen STI rates among troops at levels that alarmed public health officials, and the newly available antibiotic penicillin offered, for the first time, the possibility of a genuine cure. But researchers needed to know more. How effective was penicillin at different stages of infection? Could it be used prophylactically? What were the precise mechanisms of transmission? To answer these questions, you needed to study the disease in human beings. And to study the disease in human beings at the stage most useful to researchers, you needed people who were actively infected, which meant, in the most direct reading of the research protocol, deliberately infecting them. The lead researcher was Dr. John Cutler, a public health physician who had worked on earlier STI research in the United States and who would later become infamous for his involvement in the Tuskegee syphilis study, a decades-long experiment in which Black American men with syphilis were deliberately left untreated in order to observe the natural progression of the disease. Cutler's career traces a line through some of the most consequential ethical failures in the history of American medicine. Guatemala was chosen because Cutler and his colleagues had already attempted similar inoculation studies on prison inmates in Indiana and found the ethical and logistical obstacles, even in an era of minimal research ethics protections, too significant to overcome. Guatemala offered fewer obstacles. The Guatemalan government, under a complicated arrangement involving public health collaboration, provided access to prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients. The American researchers arrived with their protocols and their penicillin and their carefully documented indifference to consent. The methods employed in Guatemala were strikingly direct. The researchers needed subjects who were actively infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid. They needed to be able to observe and document the infection's progression and then test whether penicillin could treat or prevent it. To produce infections, they used several approaches. Sex workers who were already infected with STIs were paid to have intercourse with prisoners in the Guatemalan penitentiary. When this method proved unreliable, not all men became infected through sexual contact. The researchers moved to more direct inoculation. Bacteria were applied directly to the genitals, forearms, and in some cases, the faces of subjects. In certain cases, abrasions were made in the skin to ensure the bacteria would enter the bloodstream. Syphilitic material was injected directly into the spinal fluid of some subjects. Researchers documented the progression of infection, the development of symptoms, and the response to penicillin treatment in careful clinical notes that they filed away and took home. The subjects were prisoners who had no meaningful ability to refuse participation. They were soldiers in the Guatemalan military. They were patients in the National Mental Health Hospital of Guatemala, people with psychiatric conditions who lacked both the awareness and the capacity to understand what was being done to them. They were orphaned children. The consent documentation, where it existed at all, was minimal and largely meaningless in context. A prisoner in a Guatemalan jail in 1946, approached by American researchers with government backing, did not occupy a position from which genuine refusal was possible. A psychiatric patient who could not understand the procedure being described to them could not consent to it in any meaningful sense. The researchers knew this. It was, in part, why they had come to Guatemala. At least 83 of the more than 300 subjects are documented to have died, though researchers have noted that the full death toll may never be known. The records were incomplete, and the Guatemalan subjects had no advocates documenting their fates. The experiment concluded in 1948. Dr. Cutler returned to the United States. The records were filed, and the Guatemala syphilis experiment disappeared from public knowledge for 63 years. It was not rediscovered by investigative journalists or through a leaked government document. It was found by a medical historian named Susan Reverby, who, while researching the Tuskegee syphilis study, stumbled across Cutler's personal papers, archived, apparently without anyone having examined them carefully, at the University of Pittsburgh. In those papers, she found the documentation of what had been done in Guatemala. Reverby alerted the Obama administration before publishing her findings. The administration's response was swift, and by the standards of government accountability, unusually direct. In October 2010, President Barack Obama personally telephoned Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom to apologize. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius issued a joint statement describing the experiments as clearly unethical. A presidential bioethics commission was established to investigate and produce a full report. The report, published in 2011, confirmed the essential facts and was unambiguous in its moral assessment. The experiments had violated every standard of research ethics applicable at the time, including the standards that the United States itself had helped establish at Nuremberg just 1 year before the Guatemala experiment began. This is the detail that should stop you cold. The Nuremberg Code, the first international standard establishing that voluntary consent is the absolute cornerstone of ethical human research, was adopted in 1947. The Guatemala experiment was conducted in 1946 and 1948. American researchers were sitting in the courtroom at Nuremberg, watching Nazi doctors be prosecuted for conducting medical experiments on unwilling human subjects, while their colleagues were in Guatemala doing the same thing. The Nuremberg Code was written in part by American judges. It established principles that American officials publicly declared to be universal and inviolable. And within 1 year of its adoption, American researchers were violating every one of those principles on the other side of the world, on a population chosen specifically for its vulnerability. The legal action that followed Reverby's discovery was extensive but ultimately limited. Guatemala filed a complaint with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Survivors and the families of deceased subjects pursued legal claims in American courts. Those claims were largely dismissed on grounds of sovereign immunity, the legal doctrine that protects governments from being sued for official acts. The people of Guatemala received an apology from the American president. They did not receive justice in any form that could be meaningfully distinguished from the absence of justice. The Guatemala syphilis experiment sits at the intersection of several of the most important ethical failures in this entire series. It involves the deliberate infliction of serious, potentially lethal disease on people who could not refuse. It involves a government that publicly proclaimed ethical standards and privately ignored them. It involves the selection of victims on the basis of their vulnerability and their inability to hold their perpetrators accountable. And it involves a secrecy maintained for 63 years, long enough that most of the victims and all of the perpetrators were dead before the truth was known. What it means, in the most direct possible terms, is that stated values are not the same as practiced values. That a government can sign the Nuremberg Code and violate it simultaneously. That the gap between what institutions say about ethics and what they actually do behind closed doors is not a gap that closes automatically or reliably. It is a gap that closes only through transparency, oversight, and the persistent, unglamorous work of people like Susan Reverby, who spend years in archives reading documents that nobody told them to find. It also means that the protection of vulnerable populations, prisoners, psychiatric patients, the poor, the disenfranchised, those in countries with less geopolitical power, cannot be left to the goodwill of those conducting research on them. Goodwill failed in Guatemala. Institutional review failed. Professional ethics failed. International law failed. The only thing that eventually worked was one historian in a university archive reading someone's personal papers. Accountability requires witnesses. Witnesses require access. And access, in a world that prefers its ethical failures sealed in boxes and filed quietly away, requires people who refuse to stop looking. The Guatemala syphilis experiment was hidden for 63 years. It was revealed by accident by a historian who was looking for something else. The apology came from a president who had nothing to do with what was done. The perpetrators lived their full lives without legal consequence. And the more than 1,300 people who were infected without their consent, the at least 83 who died, they received nothing. Not in time. Not in a form that meant anything to the people who had suffered. That is what impunity looks like. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a reckoning captured on camera. Just a box of papers sitting in a university archive for 60 years, waiting for someone to open it. We are now at the final experiment in this series. The last stop in the darkest depths. We close not with a government program or a university study or a military operation, but with a man, a physician in a uniform who called himself a doctor while doing things that medicine was invented to prevent. His name was Joseph Mengele. And what happened in the twin blocks of Auschwitz-Birkenau under his direction was the event that made the entire world of research ethics necessary. The atrocity that forced humanity to write down in law what should never be done to a human being in the name of science. That is the final script of this series. And it is waiting for you in the next video. Subscribe so you're there for it. Leave a comment. The Guatemala experiment raises a question I want to hear your answer to. How do we ensure that stated values become practiced values? Tell me what you think. And thank you deeply and sincerely for being here for this entire journey.